why don't we get started here with our afternoon panel, the first of the afternoon panel, which is on lessons from Europe. Okay. We have a distinguished group of panelists today. We will be starting with Kevin Deegan-Krause of the Department of Political Science at Wayne State University. And Kevin is a specialist in Central and Eastern Europe, so he will be bringing that perspective to the discussion. He will be followed by Bertjan Verbeek of the Department of Political Science of Radboud University in the Netherlands, who will be focused more on Western Europe. And then our two discussants today will be Zeynep Somer-Topcu, our very own Department of Government UT Austin professor, and followed by Lorinc Redei of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, who will also be a discussant. I also want to, for the people watching the live streaming, you can ask questions via hashtag #UTPopulism, correct? And so we look forward to getting your questions as well. All right, let me turn it over to Kevin then.
It's not usual that at my university it works when I hit the button. So I want to thank you all for having this event. I've taken the liberty of retitling the panel slightly, actually the whole event, because it occurs to me that what we've been talking about, we talked about this a little bit out in the hall, it is nominally about President Trump's populism, but clearly dig a little bit and you get into much deeper and more complicated questions, which is, I think, remarkably useful, because once that question of populism is no longer around, that question will be around, and I think that's really important. I want to start with a sort of comment to my wife. As I was leaving yesterday, she rewrote this old, so apparently this is not an old Chinese curse. It's not old, it's not Chinese, it may well be a curse, but my wife rewrote it this way. And I never wanted or expected the work that I do in Eastern Europe on dictatorship or quasi-dictatorship to be relevant in my own country, but here we are. So what I want to do really quickly is to talk about the application, and I want to stick in this case fairly close to the cases and their application to the Trump government. I think in the conversation we can go pretty far afield and talk about this. There are only a few things I know in life, and so I want to talk about at least a couple of those. And then we can maybe talk and expand that out. And we've got another presenter and a couple commentators who can broaden the world out even more. So I want to get rid of this guy and move on to... By the way, apparently you're not supposed to drive your golf cart on the green. I didn't know that, but this is... Right? Yeah, that's violating a norm. And it's violating a norm in a precise way of not actually doing the work that you need to do to get the job done. So I thought it was a particularly useful analogy once I learned the underlying golf norms. Here's what I want to do. I want to talk about the kind of comparison I want to make very briefly. I want to talk about what happened in Eastern Europe. I want to talk about what's happening in the United States. And then I want to talk about what we can learn. So super simple stuff. And the first thing that I actually want to talk about very briefly is what I'm going to actually do. So I am somebody who has sometimes looked at society from the perspective of political institutions, sometimes looked at political institutions from the perspective of society. I'm in a mode right now, a book I'm working on and some other stuff, where I'm looking again from the party institutional perspective. And so what I want to make in the next 15 minutes is primarily a party-based, institutional-based discussion. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that we can talk about from the societal level up, and actually Bart's got a lot to say about that, so I'm going to sort of keep that a little bit aside. So this is going to be primarily institution, primarily sort of political party and institution-driven. So that's the first thing that I want to say. Within the question of parties, I want to talk about two different aspects of parties. So I want to talk about the ideational aspect of parties. There's a great new book by Jennifer Sear about Latin American parties, which she made this nice division, which has always been there, but it crystallized it for me. So I want to talk about the ideational elements of the parties, what they're saying and how they're acting about it. And I want to talk about their organizational aspects. And actually in a very raw, kind of low-level, simple simple way. But I want to use those two levels to make distinctions. And then within the ideational questions, I want to make a kind of triple distinction. And I thought I was going to have to explain this, but then a paper comes up that says in fewer words what I tried to say far better. So I'm going to let Bart talk a lot about the sort of detail and definitional questions. But I love to see the fact. It's heartening to me that I'm not on the wrong track here, because there's somebody who's saying things better and more efficiently. So I'm going to steal that stuff if that's okay. But to really talk about these things as distinct elements. So the populism, the nationalism, and the authoritarianism as distinct element. And I know populism is our focus, and I know populism and the populism of the cases that I've studied are the reason why I'm standing up in front of you. But I want to talk a little bit about these elements as well, because I think they're really important. And I think in some cases, those predominate over the populism. There are other cases where the populism predominates over the nationalism and authoritarianism, and that has different effects on how we can use these for a comparison set. So that's my basic kind of where I'm coming from framework, but really what I want to talk about is what happened in Eastern and Central Europe. And this is a dangerous topic, and my students know not to get me started on this unless they want class to be eaten up by my stories. But really, this is the person for whom, this is the man at whose feet I almost literally studied populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. His name is Vladimir Mečiar. Nobody remembers him anymore because he made some really serious mistakes. He failed in what he tried to do. But in the process, he created a really remarkable template for how do you take over a new democracy. He's not the only one, but he's a particularly nice one, and he was on our list of populists, and I know it's a little bit about this guy that you want to hear a little bit about, and so I thought I would just tell you a little bit about this guy. So he was prime minister 3 different times. Twice he was kicked out by his former party members or others in coalition with opposition parties. And the third time he got in 1994, he served for a full 4-year term because he had learned the lesson from those previous years. So what did he do? Well, I want to argue that he was primarily someone with an authoritarian temperament or mentality, someone who didn't brook having anyone tell him what to do. And because of the institutional and sociocultural environment in which he found himself, and because he had certain skills that would let him do it, he was able to create circumstances in which no one could tell him what to do. So there's a really long discourse that we can talk about institutional accountability and electoral accountability. But the brief story is that Mečiar, once he took office in 1994, having learned his lesson from the 2 previous times, systematically set out to encroach on rival institutions so that there would be no counter-institution that could countervail him. And he began with parliament and parliamentary committees, and then moved on to oversight committees over particular government agencies, and then he went on to those government agencies themselves, and then he went on to media, and then he went on to privatization, and so on. And each step enabled the next step. So for about the first year and a half of his term in office, from 1994 to about 1996, he systematically encroached. He systematically removed as much accountability as he could from the broader system. What he lacked, however, was a constitutional majority. He lacked entirely docile partners in his coalition, but he had enough to take control of that government, hold control of it for a significant amount of time, but not to control the overall system, so that by the time 1998 came around, he was not able to maintain his voters to such an extent that they would maintain him in office, and he was not able to control the electoral institutions in such a way that, despite certain efforts at cheating and testing the waters to see if he could cheat, he wasn't able to stay in office. But during that period, he systematically encroached. He systematically almost built an authoritarian regime. And with a couple more members of parliament or one more member of the Constitutional Court, he probably could have developed a regime that looks a lot like the regime of this guy, who is not showing because I'm 1 slide behind, Viktor Orban. Who was prime minister of Hungary from 2002 to 2006, again learned certain lessons and returned. This time you don't see an end date on his term because he is still in office. And the reason he's still in office is that he learned not only from Mečiar, who was a nice example for him to follow, but also from his term 2002 to 2006, how to stay in office. Mečiar and Orban followed almost precisely the same roadmap of taking office and then encroaching systematically on rival institutions, both within their realm and then using the ones within their realm to expand it outward to include other realms beyond. So once you've taken control of government institutions, you can then move on to those to use government influence to help you control media, to use government influence to help you control firms, to use the revenues from those firms that you receive in one form or another to again help you to control, buy, modify media. And then finally, you can use some of these institutions to help you, if not control the electoral process, to control the playing field in which the electoral process is played. And whether that's dealing with how people are registered to vote, to what the electoral law looks like, to how many members in parliament there are, you can use a variety of mechanisms to control those, to control electoral accountability. Orban succeeded in large part, at least for the most, for now at least, where Mečiar failed and has actually managed to do it. He was able to succeed because the pre-existing Hungarian electoral system gave him a constitutional majority, which Mečiar never had. So he came in with certain advantages, but he also was able to learn from what previous folks had done. This is the worst case scenario for the region. I mean, if you look at the area, you can see a lot of other governments. You see the Kaczynski government in Poland attempting some of these same steps. You can look at the governments in Macedonia, earlier governments in Serbia and in Croatia. This is really the apotheosis of what you can do when you eliminate horizontal or institutional accountability and then lean heavily on vertical accountability. He's still in office, and who knows how long that dash present will last, but it could last a considerably long time. There is an interesting counterexample, and that's this guy. So this guy was also listed on our list of populists. And he is an interesting case of a populist. This is somebody who used populist rhetoric initially, somebody who talked about himself as a man of the people, who talked about a corrupt elite, who said that Mečiar and Mečiar's opponent were all pretty much the same thing. And he did that initially in order to get elected to parliament. But once in parliament, failing to get the prime ministership, he revamped his party. He reorganized his party, and he built it in a very different way. And so what he did was to move from this initial kind of more purely populist element with a few bits of nationalism and authoritarianism to actually reducing the populism somewhat and emphasizing not only the leftism of his party, which is yet another dimension, but also to build organizational strength, sometimes to play the national card, sometimes to play the authoritarian card, but almost always to build up, to work with organization. And so as you can see from the diagrams here, what I'm going to be arguing is that Mečiar and Orban, they sought authority. In the process, they played the national card quite heavy. Mečiar and Orban both created the idea of a nation as their core support. In Slovak, there's this lovely phrase of the state forming or titular people. It's the people to whom the country belongs. Every country in Central and Eastern Europe has one because they all have names named after ethnic groups. So Czech Republic belongs to the Czechs. Slovakia theoretically belongs to the Slovaks. Often their constitutions begin with something like, we the Slovak nation, we the Hungarian nation, oh, and also all those other people who live here as well. But it's a notion of national identity that is built around ethnicity, largely around language, and it is a notion of ethnic ownership of the society as a whole. So Mečiar not only played the authority card, but he played the national card. He played the populism card to a certain extent, but in many ways the populism card was bound up with his national card. The people that he claimed to represent were a specifically ethnic people. And he opposed the elites, but he opposed the elites only as long as he wasn't one of the elites. Once he became one of the elites, he had a much harder time maintaining that kind of separation, although he tried to blame it on foreign elites outside in Hungary or in the European Union or elsewhere. So his populism declined over time, but his nationalism and authoritarianism remained strong, as did his internal party organization. On the other hand, Fico strengthened his organization at the expense of his populism and didn't really play the others. When he was removed from his own framework, when he was allowed to govern on his own, much more success than Mečiar ever had, he didn't turn in the national authoritarian directions. He actually maintained a largely democratic government, not perfect, not uncorrupt, but one that could sustain itself. Finally, there is a group of other politicians that I'm not going to talk about in great deal, except to say that these are in some ways populists par excellence. They're not radical right populists. They're not radical left populists. We can't even really call them centrist populists. These are anti-elitist, pure new populists, however you want to call them. Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, Boris Kolar. These are all people that you wouldn't know, largely because they've appeared and then disappeared. They haven't necessarily been able to sustain themselves. Babiš may become the next prime minister of the Czech Republic, but we'll see how long that lasts. All of these folks emphasized populism extremely strongly and didn't really do anything else. And in particular, they didn't build strong organizational bases. And so when the party came around next time, two things had gone wrong. First, having been in office, it had nothing to show for itself and usually showed that it was just as corrupt as the other. So its anti-elite rhetoric didn't really work. And it had no organization and really no other bases to fall back on. One of the few counterexamples is this guy Okamura. Okamura actually, initially after being sort of in the center, expanded out to include a fairly radical nationalist emphasis, talking about immigrants, talking about Muslims, of which the Czech Republic has very few, suggesting that people raise pigs and walk them in front of kebab restaurants in order to annoy Muslims. It prompted one of the best acts of political resistance, the International Day of Kebabs Against Stupidity, that we saw in the Czech Republic. But this is the kind of thing that we've seen in the Czech Republic. Aside from Mečiar and Orbán, most of them haven't been successful at actually taking over government. Either they've taken over government and haven't proven dangerous to democracy, or they haven't developed the kind of institutional chops that would allow them to keep that element. Which brings us to this guy. And what can we say about this? And there's a lot in the paper, largely because I found myself, when I was studying Eastern Europe, I felt I had to be incredibly careful that I wasn't mischaracterizing what the people who I most disagreed with were saying. In this case, I disagree with a lot he has to say, and so I felt I really had to sort of justify that everything that I was saying is accurate. You can read the paper if you want that, but I think most of you can probably get a sense that what this particular leader is strong at is a kind of national rhetoric, which actually sounds a lot like the state-forming people rhetoric, a populism that everyone in this room, no matter what else they disagree on, agrees on, a degree of authoritarianism that at the very least says, don't tell me what to do, I'm not listening to anybody, and almost no organizational ability whatsoever. I mean, it's been called ineptness, it's been called stupidity during this particular conference, that this is not someone who's really capable of structuring a political party in such a way that it's going to work. And so there's a nice analysis by Josh Marshall. He says Trump's life has appeared in multiple acts. The first act is a builder. The second act is a TV star and brand licenser. And what's the third act going to look like? Well, Central Europe is going to tell us that it's probably going to look a lot more like that than about Bill. I mean, the way he's structured his party, the way he's structured, and that means something for what we are worried about, what we can actually learn. So what can we learn? And this is the last three things I'm going to say. First of all, if we look at Trump, and we look at him in those dimensions that are important, nationalism, authoritarianism, populism, but also organizational capacity, which Mečiar and Orbán had and the others didn't, which makes this stuff possible. Trump looks a lot more like these flash-in-the-pan new populists than he does like Mečiar and Orbán. He's got a lot more strengths, a lot more in common on the nationalist and populist side, and a lot less in common on the organizational capacity side. And I think that tells us about maybe what we have to fear from Trump, and it allows us to actually think about our dangers. And one thing that's come up quite a bit is that when we say we're afraid of Trump's populism, what is it that we're afraid of when we're afraid of Trump's populism? Well, this kind of East European option gives us a set of menu items from which to choose, or in this case, not choose, about what we would or wouldn't be necessarily afraid of. And the great news here is that they seem to run in a rough path from things that are dangerous but not very probable to things which are probable but who knows how dangerous they are. So the kind of Orbán success, the kind of Mečiar efforts at encroachment, at a full-on takeover of government, those seem pretty unlikely, largely because of the absence of that organizational element. Orbán and Mečiar had tightly controlled, centralized parties. They managed to hit that sweet spot between organization and control. What it may look a little bit more like is those final years of Mečiar that I didn't really talk about, where he was flailing around, firing prosecutors and doing other things like that in order to keep himself from getting into trouble. When he'd failed to achieve all of his goals, he started to react defensively, seeking to get rid of people in ways that were not acceptable, and there were reactions. There were consequences for that. The fourth thing is what I called opportunistic encroachment, and this is the idea that Mečiar, Orbán to a certain extent, were constantly on the lookout for weaknesses in institutions. Even when they weren't able to be fully successful, they were able to sort of stick the knife in and twist it, not necessarily out of a systematic plan, although Orbán's much more systematic than Mečiar, but about an insight that this institution is weak or that institution is weak, or maybe I could get away with that. I think that's certainly something that we have more to fear from Mečiar. And then finally, the new populist insurgency and fragmentation. By this, what I mean is that Trump looks a lot more like those new parties in Central and Eastern Europe that pop up and disappear. Now, maybe this is an example of giving somebody a hammer and everything looks like a nail, because I'm working on a book on new parties, parties that pop up and disappear. But Trump looks a hell of a lot, to me, like these new parties that pop up, disrupt the system, and then disappear. The interesting thing about those parties in Western and Eastern Europe is they don't then return the system to a glassy pond the way it was before, because new parties come up in almost exactly the same space, and the cycle continues over and over again. Fortuyn and then Wilders. And you can look in certain countries like Slovenia, we're on the third and fourth cycle of new parties coming in, changing things around, and moving the situation. So last thing I'm going to say is legacies. I've noted that there are two kinds of horror movies. There's the first kind of horror movie where you make the monster, where the monster is something that is of human creation. There is another kind, actually the kind that I have rather a hankering for, is the kind where you don't make the monster, you just dig up something that's been there a long time, that's been sort of lying around and dangerous the whole time. I think even after Trump's gone, and that may be a month or that may be several years, I have to say no other conference has ever had me checking the news every 15 minutes to see if my paper was irrelevant before. But I think what we've got here are the legacies there. And some of these are things that he just scratched the surface and they popped up, and others are things that he helped to crystallize, like Dr. Frankenstein. I mean, I think, first of all, this idea of a state-forming nation, this ethnic nationalism, I think we've known it was there. There were some great analyses after 9/11 about what that would look like in the United States, but we're seeing it in full flower. Trump didn't make it, but I think he helped to catalyze it a little bit. Second one are the unwritten rules, and I think Steve talked about this really effectively. The United States is built on norms. The constitutional document itself is very brief. Even the case law and other stuff is vague in a lot of ways. So we depend on people saying, I don't want to do that, or I can't do that. And there's this great Far Side cartoon that I've always loved. They're lighting their arrows. Can they do that? I mean, I think the ability of somebody like Trump, somebody like these innovators in Eastern Central Europe, is to walk on the stage not knowing or caring about the existing situation and to start it on fire because they don't know that they're not allowed to do that. And they can take advantage of that particular position. And then finally, you said it better, I like your hardball phrase better, the ruthless exploitation, this idea that you are going to push these things as far as you possibly can. This is related to polarization, as is something that I've been thinking about calling primary shift. And what we seem to see in the United States, and again, it's a metaphor, but I think it's one that at least has some purchase, is the idea that maybe instead of thinking of the US as a two-party system, we think about it as two-party systems. And we have this almost visceral cleavage, and the cleavage word comes up in almost every paper, that you don't see anything going across. What that leaves you with is two almost, not entirely, but largely separate nations and largely separate political systems, where you can't really cross over one to the other. So you have a high degree of polarization, even if there's similarity. Since things aren't crossing over, where does the attention shift to? Well, the attention shifts to the place where politics can actually happen, and that is at the primary level, the intra-party level. And I love this idea of both the informal norms and also Ken's idea of these multiple streams, because I think if you combine those two, what you get is a sense that our political parties have themselves become much more the areas of contention. And so these kind of European pop-up parties, we're not seeing third parties in the United States, but what we're seeing is third-party type candidates within the existing parties, not just the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. And so I wonder if these big messes that we call American parties, we aren't better off conceptualizing by thinking about them in a way that looks a lot more like European party systems as a whole. And I think that can help us sort of rethink how we're going to think about Europe, or how we're thinking about politics. And really, that's all that I have to say, except for this lovely piece by Scott Listfield called Empty Palace, which I just felt I had to share with you. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this wonderful conference with all these wonderful people. I'm very glad I can be part of it. My piece is co-authored with Andrei Zaslov, colleague from my university, who is very sad that he cannot be here. He'd love to have been here. Basically, our paper is about populist leadership in Western Europe. And what I would like to do is basically the following. I would like to argue that we need to think at least about the concept of leadership in general and populist leadership in particular, to reflect on what the sources and effects of populist leadership might be. And then I will illustrate these issues by focusing on 4 cases of populists in government, followed by implications for the US under Trump. The 4 cases are 4 parties in 2 countries, in the Netherlands and Italy. In the Netherlands, the list Pim Fortuyn, LPF, which skyrocketed in 2002 and was part of a short-lived government, and the Party for Freedom of Geert Wilders, who has been part of a minority government in a very specific way. He supported the government but did not actually deliver ministers to the government, yet secured specific agreements and promises on PVV policies. A government which lasts not even 2 years. In Italy, I will be looking at the Forza Italia and Lega Nord parties that 3 times formed a coalition lasting in total more than 10 years. As you can see, they are all part of a more parliamentary democracy type of system as opposed to the US. And I excluded from my thoughts at least the presidential systems in Europe, such as France and Finland. Okay, populist leadership. I think we talk a lot about leaders, but we're not always really zooming in what that really entails. We have a tendency to talk a lot about their individual traits and what they do and what they don't and what they accomplish or not. But I think it is important to think through what actually the relationship between leaders and followers might mean. Because in the end, leadership is based also on followership, and that relationship, which is also a power relationship, forms the basis of what happens. When we talk in this paper about populism, we adopt the thin ideology approach, although that is not shared by everyone, but that's what we do, partly because we want to link up with leadership and followership, which is about juxtaposing the good people versus the bad elites. Political leadership we conceive of as the capacity to mobilize people to effectuate goals held by both the leader and her or his followers. And that sort of means that for us, populist leadership must be related to 1, the interests of the good people that are pursued by the leader and effectuated possibly. As 2nd, the elements of the specific thin ideology, so to speak, that he or she borrows from to make up for a lack of ideology. Sources of leadership. Lots can be said. I cannot do that here. A bit is in the paper, a lot is not. But nevertheless, we have to think of personal characteristics which sort of invite people to at least conceive following the specific leader. That might be charisma, it could be demonstrated success to be a true outsider, etc. 2nd, we need an insight in their capacity to tap into the feelings, and that's the relationship leader-follower that we are looking into the feelings of people that feel underprivileged in their societies. But most importantly, also we have to take into account at least 3 types of constraints on this relationship. We feel that is, first of all, the dominant discourses in society and changes in that, which sort of links to Bart Bonakowski's, I'm not sure, term resonance in his paper, we feel. As an example, in the Netherlands in the 1990s, there was a radical right party that never really, well, made it into parliament, was never really an accepted party because its anti-migration rhetoric was defined as racist and even fascist. And the funny thing is that 10 years later, people like Wilders say the same things, or even worse, and that is sort of generally accepted, by which we wish to indicate that we have to be aware that there is a discourse about what is acceptable and what is not, so how you frame your strategies in mobilizing your followers, but that context can also change, and we maybe also need to investigate why. Second, the space, so to speak, for leadership is constrained by the elements he or she takes on from the borrowed ideology in question. And thirdly, it is constrained by the electoral and party system in which the populist leader party is operating. When we talk about the effects of leadership, I think we need to first think through, okay, what does this person really want to lead? A party, a small group, a movement, a nation, a country, the world. And depending on the specific objectives of these people, that may tap into different strategies and different origins of their followers. Secondly, we have to think through what it is that they want to seek, what they seek to achieve in terms of societal change, in terms of both scope and size. And that means that most of all, we should just be careful in just using the words, I would say, populist leadership. First case, power, populists in power. The Lega Nord, the Northern League in Italy, which rose as part of a group of regionalist groupings and parties in the north of Italy in the 1980s. I will deal with these parties in a similar way by focusing on the context of their rise, the idea they have about people versus elite, the leadership style displayed by the leader, the borrowed ideology, if any, that they adopted, the party system in which they have to operate, and, which is also a theme for this conference, of course, the implications it had for, in this case, Italian democracy. The context of the Lega Nord is, first of all, huge corruption in the so-called First Republic, dominated by the Christian Democratic Party, the dominance itself being a major problem. The money transfers from the north, the hardworking north, to the south. And thirdly, very importantly, also for all cases, actually, I would say, in Western Europe, the end of the Cold War, which basically changed the dominant discourse of what is the acceptable enemy and so forth, left in disarray the traditional parties that no longer had the communists to blame, which in Italy meant that the Communist Party was no longer a relevant opponent for the Christian Democrats, however, to rally against. People versus elite. It's the hardworking Northerners versus Roma ladra, Rome as a thief. The idea of Rome just taking away all resources and giving them to whatever it pleases. And importantly, the invention of a new nation, Padania, the people of the Po region. And that's, I think, a key element in understanding the leadership of Umberto Bossi in the Lega Nord in this idea of basically creating among people who sort of may have some kind of hidden identities among themselves, the idea of a true nation. That's where the picture is from. It's Umberto Bossi doing his big tour along the River Po, and at separate points along the river, taking and drinking the water from the Po as the sign of this is the pure water of the pure people. Leadership style. Bossi was a very strong leader, quite hierarchically, but importantly managed and intended to build up a very strong grassroots party organization, which is still partly explains the continuity of the Lega in the Italian political system. Its borrowed ideology was first more regionalist, nationalist, maybe if you think of the people of the Po, but then moved much more to the radical right. The party system changed from a multi-party system dominated by Christian Democrats into, and this is an important element, on the basis of regularly changing electoral rules, what one might call multi-polta bilaterality, a fragmented system which basically created two blocks, center-left, center-right. And importantly, there was very few electoral volatility across the blocks and much electoral volatility within the blocks, which basically condemned the center-right parties, Berlusconi's Forza Italia, the Lega Nord, and the post-fascist Alleanza Nazionale into a permanent coalition, actually making them strike deals about who would put candidates in which type of constituencies in order to balance out some kind of fair representation among themselves in parliament. The implications for democracy are important. First of all, the Lega in the late 80s, early 90s was instrumental in bringing down the First Republic by denouncing the corruption of the traditional mainstream party politicians. In the Second Republic, it became much more part of the establishment itself, also being indicted for corruption later on, and hence ushering in, just like Berlusconi would do, a new populist party that I will not discuss here, but only if you want to ask questions about it, the Five Star Movement. Berlusconi came in a little bit later. The context was the breakdown, the true crisis of the breakdown of the First Republic between 1992 and 1994, added to, again, the end of communism as a legitimate opponent. He was fearing after the end of the Cold War that communists would actually become too big, decided to build a party of his own. His leadership style is very personalized, based on charisma, based on his idea as a hard-working businessman who was successful without the help of government, even though in the past he had been active himself in the Socialist Party, but nevertheless. And he managed to create a sort of loosely organized party, less strong than the Lega Nord, yet a party. His borrowed ideology was much more neoliberalism, and that was expressed in particularly the first and second governments of Berlusconi. The implications for democracy here was that he helped polarize the media and the judiciary, but we should not forget that that polarization had already been going on before he came to power, and that both media and the judiciary in Italy were highly contested as politicized units. Much more importantly, even I would say that Berlusconi created an acceptable, legitimate center-right. We should not underestimate that before that, there was basically no real center-right in Italy. Well, some currents maybe within the Christian Democratic Party, but a true big center-right bloc actually wasn't there. Most of parties were afraid to be called fascist and therefore avoided the center-right position. The Netherlands then, the list Pim Fortuyn, here he is, in his famous acceptance speech for the candidacy for his own party, saluting and saying, "At your service," which was really the promise he made to the electorate. The context here is extreme electoral volatility that had grown in the Netherlands in the 1990s, even though very few politicians and political scientists, apart from my colleagues in Twente, I have to commend them, managed to witness and observe that volatility. Dissatisfaction with government performance, and this unease with migration. Personalized leadership style built on his charisma, exceptional for the Netherlands, I would say, testified by the tens of thousands of people who mourned his death after he was shot a few days before the 2002 parliamentary elections, shot and killed, that is. Interestingly, Fortuyn appealed to the Republican experiment of the early 1800s in the Netherlands, which was a sequel to the French revolutionary values, introducing already ideas about a widespread right to vote and elements of direct democracy. He opposes particularly the mainstream parties, displayed an eclectic type of borrowed ideology, picking from left and right-wing elements. And the party system, although fragmented extremely, there was always at least some possibility of forming coalitions of mainstream parties, but what we see, and that is going on until this very day, is a extreme decline of the support for main parties, making basically traditional coalition government difficult for the Netherlands. Fortuyn clearly was a catalyst for a neglected undercurrent. He put on the agenda things that were, before that, political taboos, but his party, after his death, was neutralized basically by being co-opted into the government that lived for about 5 months, and that sort of was the end of it, because, and here again we are with resonance, the norm in the Netherlands would be that you have to show responsibility, which is a very vague term, what that exactly would mean, but it was spun in such a way that the Fortuyn's party had shown to be incapable of showing responsibility, which is also true for the Wilders government, the government supported by Wilders between 2010 and 2012. He felt he had to leave that that government because of his because we didn't want to have budget cuts. Leaving the government is wrong. I have to end in 2 minutes, I realize that. And he was again accused of being irresponsible. And that interestingly took away for a while quite some of his impact on Dutch politics, but recurred over the past 2 years. as he was riding high in the polls, all mainstream parties felt compelled to take over positions of the PVV regarding migration and Europe, which basically means that although some people would be happy that he did not come out number one, the sad thing is actually that mainstream parties sort of copied much of what he proposed originally. Gets me to the lessons I would like to point out. First of all, 4 lessons. First, populism can be beneficial to democracy, I would say, even though here we talk about it mostly in a negative way, because it can make a democracy in a way more inclusive. It happened at least at some moments in both the Netherlands and Italy. And in that sense, I would like to pose the question whether the USA can continue to be gridlocked and whether it can continue to exclude large groups from its democracy. Secondly, it is important, party systems and electoral systems matter. Obviously, it was already pointed out before that the majoritarian two-party system here is not likely to change and therefore defines both competition and chances for leaders. I would say in our cases show that both the reduction of the size of the mainstream parties in the Netherlands, as well as the blocked center-left, center-right coalitions in Italy, dictate the strategies, I would say, for populist parties. Third, very importantly, I think in Western Europe, particularly, probably also Eastern, but I'm not sure after the presentation, party organization is vital, I would even say, for success and longevity. In that sense, I still think it's important to realize that Orban in the end did not run as an independent, and I'm not sure whether he would have won as an independent. And control of a party is needed for long-term impact, as shown by Forza Italia particularly and the Lega Nord. Lastly, populist parties may have more effect in the opposition than in government, particularly when mainstream parties feel that because of the opinion polls they need to emulate the populist agenda. And I think that might be a much more grave danger than having them for a few years in government. The effect of government is not lasting that long. When they are co-opted in government, they usually are kicked out, if you want to, fairly quickly, at least in the Netherlands. And that means that they might even be delegitimized for quite some years. That's basically what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
This is tall. I don't know how to. That's okay. Doesn't, oh, yeah, it does. There you go. Okay. Well, thank you, Kurt and Raoul, for organizing this very interesting conference and for the presenters for interesting papers today. Kurt and Raoul posed 3 questions to guide our discussion. What are the strategies for populist leaders to further their interests, to increase their support? What are or should be the strategies of other parties, institutions, rivals to tackle with these populist movements? And what are the consequences and impacts on democracy? These are all important questions that the participants are doing a good job in addressing overall, but I think one question should come first before answering all these questions, and this is about defining what we mean with populism, which is probably the most challenging question. Kurt mentioned in his speech several characteristics of a populist leader, such as having an anti-elitist rhetoric, claiming of representing the popular will, personalistic appeal, seeking enemies, creating and feeding into confrontations and polarization, etc. Yet, as we see from both Kevin's and Bertjan's work, it's not that easy to identify who is a populist, what is a populist party, and who is not a populist based on this criteria. Especially, as Kevin argues, the boundaries are not very lucid when we think about populism, authoritarianism, nationalism. Both presenters do a good job, I think, of attacking this question, but I think they both need more justifications in terms of how they define the term populism and how, in turn, they classify different leaders across Europe as populist or not. Because after all, in order to be able to compare and contrast leaders from Europe and Latin America with Trump, we first need to have an agreed-upon conceptualization of populism and populist leaders. Without a clear definition and a concept of populism, I find it hard to move to the actual important questions that Kurt and Raul posed regarding these leader strategies, rival party strategies, and impacts for democracy. Saying that, let's say that we actually have a definition of populism, and now we have a set of leaders which we can classify as populist and could be compared to Trump, such as Berlusconi in Italy, Marine Le Pen, which is not one of our cases here in France, but probably we could all agree that she's a populist leader, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and so on and so forth. I actually am going to argue that things actually look more optimistic in Europe compared to what we have here in the US. And that is not only because Wilders and Le Pen lost in the Netherlands and France respectively this past spring, but because I argue that different institutional settings we are dealing with in the parliamentary European systems, especially in Western Europe, that are really ingrained in, that are important, defining characteristics of the institutions there, they can actually limit the powers of these populist movements and leaders across Europe. This may come as a surprise to you, given that actually Kurt in his opening speech said that the lack of checks and balances in Europe makes it an even more dangerous place for the rise of populist movements. I disagree. While the checks and balances may not be named as such, there are many implicit and explicit rules, institutions, and norms especially across Western Europe, that limit the rise of such movements. And I would actually encourage the presenters to discuss with more details these underlying institutions and factors that helped or hurt populist leaders across Western and Eastern European countries, which I believe are important to understand in order to be able to evaluate and understand what we are dealing with here with Trump. So, for instance, many European countries can be classified in Leipartian terms as consensus systems. One important feature of consensus systems is that politics is mainly done in the committees, not on the parliamentary floor. These committees in consensus systems are composed of both opposition and governing parties and hence produce agreed-upon consensual policies and laws. And this limits the policy impact of rogue and populist movements, given that even if they gain government positions, their impact will be limited. Policy is being done in the committees. Another limiting institutional factor is often the qualified majority requirement to change the constitution. And given how fragmented the European parliamentary systems are in terms of the number of parties represented in the parliament, it's often super hard to achieve qualified majority coalitions to pass laws and policies. Berlusconi, for instance, didn't have that, where he needed 2/3 majority in both houses in order to change the constitution. And that limited him. And probably most importantly, the coalitional politics, of course. That reality across Europe makes it hard for populists to rule on their own and even carve an ideological niche for their own. They often have to be the smaller partners in coalition arrangements if they are included into the governments at all. Or even if they are the largest party, they have to still form a coalition government, which is not the case in Eastern Central Europe that much, but in Western Europe, that's the case. We had that example, for instance, in Belgium, which is not one of our cases, but I think was very interesting how an institution limits a populist movement that is a strong populist movement. The largest party after the 2010 election was the New Flemish Alliance Party, with its populist and separatist leader Bart de Wever. And his hands were pretty much tied, despite being the largest party in Belgium. He, as the largest party leader, only controlled 27 seats out of 150. This is the largest party in Belgium. 27 seats out of 150 seats in the Belgian parliament. And he had to form a coalition. But the problem is the constitution requires the coalition to be composed of equal number of ministers who come from the Flemish region and equal number of ministers who come from the Walloon region in order to create that equality. And guess what? The New Flemish Alliance Party was a separatist movement. They didn't form a coalition with their Walloon partners. And that, the whole debacle lasted over 500 days, and they couldn't form a government for almost 2 years after the election. And the point of which is basically what I'm saying is that you may be the largest party, but if the institutions do not allow you to exercise that power, then your impact is going to be limited. Another feature of European parliamentary systems is that the limit to the rise of these populist movements is that the multi-party structure really limits these parties, which means that populist parties on the right often face a center-right mainstream party, and those on the left face a center-left mainstream party. And this is different compared to here in the US, where the two parties represent the two different sides of ideological spectrum. And what is the consequence of this for the European parties? Well, it means that the centrist mainstream neighbor in many of these countries often starts accommodating the niche issues these populist parties start to raise. By becoming anti-European Union or anti-immigrant to some extent, these parties have shown to be effectively eliminating the support for populist parties. Conservatives in Britain eliminated the UKIP threat, the Independence Party threat, by putting the Brexit referendum on the agenda. Sarkozy eliminated to some extent the Le Pen threat by becoming more anti-immigrant. This is not possible in the US, where the debate is too polarized, and hence when a populist like Trump rises to power, Democrats do not have the chance to accommodate their policies, and that's why I think it's more depressing news here in the US. And overall, I think, as I said, this discussion of institutions, rules, and norms that are the starting points for us to see what kind of populist movements are going to emerge, what are going to be their consequences, that is missing in both papers to some extent. Kevin, for instance, did a great job of explaining different leaders and their parties' standing in various countries, but I was curious about how he would explain these differences. Why did we see a strong Orbán in Hungary but a weak Fico in Slovakia, even though he probably had the opportunity structure? How do different institutions and institutional norms explain the differences? Right? Similarly, in Bertjan's case, why did we see a long reign of Berlusconi, who lost the power and influence after ruling Italy for about 17 years? And how come we don't see such movements becoming as strong in other Western European countries? I think a focus on this institutional structure would help us understand these differences and also help us draw lessons for our understanding of Trump and his America. So despite being a rather optimist about the European experience more generally so far, let me close my comments with a rather depressing side of all this, as many others did. Yes, institutions, rules, and political parties do not allow in many countries populists to rise to power, or even if they do, they effectively limit their impacts on politics. But going back to Steve's point at the beginning, the most depressing consequence of all this populist politics is societal polarization and decline of norms of mutual toleration. And these societal dynamics were missing in these papers as well. So I would like to see more about that. Being from Turkey originally and experiencing Erdogan firsthand, which I believe should have his own chapter in this book that will come up from this conference. And hearing from my expat friends from across Europe and now experiencing some of this here in the US, I'm afraid and scared about our future. Politicians may come and go, but the polarizing rhetoric shapes societal dynamics with long-term effects. You can feel it on the streets in Turkey and even here in the US already. And that makes me worried about the future. And I would like to hear what you guys thought about this as well. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, first off, I want to thank everybody for the invitation to the conference, but also for the insightful papers that were really a pleasure to read. I want to keep to 10 minutes, so I just want to do 4 things, essentially. Give one comment each on each of the 2 papers, one comment on how I think they connect to each other, and then one comment on how the European experience can help us understand or say something new about Donald Trump. So I want to start with Bertjan's paper. And I like the distinction that he made when he was talking just now. He was talking about sources and effects of populism. I'm going to try to call it something different. The way I read it when I read the paper was that populists might be behaving differently when they're trying to gain votes, when they're trying to get into power, than how they exercise power, right? So I think there's a difference between populists seeking power and how they do that, and then how they wield power once they have it or once they're close to it if they're in a coalition government. And what I found interesting is that you showed a lot of patterns in terms of how these how these populist parties in Western Europe go about trying to get support, how they're campaigning, what kinds of messages they have. And so there seem to be certain trends about how populists go about trying to get power. The results of what they do when they're in power seem to be much more random, right? So partially it depends on whether they're in coalition or whether they actually have power. Partially has to do with organizational capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's interesting. It leads me to say two things. One, and this is something that Zeynep just talked about as well, is that it might be that the real influence of populist parties isn't really dependent on whether or not they're in power or how they wield power once they're there. It's rather that they can force mainstream parties who are in power to take some of their messages on board, right? And you gave some examples of that, but I would like to hear a lot more of you elaborating on that, on the effect of populist parties on political discourse, on the fact, for instance, that certain things that Geert Wilders is saying now that are part of the political mainstream 20 years ago were completely out of bounds. That to me is a very important change, and that might be something that you can compare the parties on. And I think it'd be really interesting to see, okay, what are the things that the Lega Nord has been talking about that were off limits, 20 years ago, but now are not. And I think that would be an interesting way also to bring in the Five-Star Movement by Beppe Grillo, right? Because I thought it was kind of interesting that you didn't talk about them. But there you can also talk about what are they trying to add into this discourse. The second thing that this differentiation between seeking and wielding power leads me to say is, it brings up a question of what happens when you have a populist leader who's very good at seeking power, very good at campaigning, but completely uninterested in wielding power. And I think you see where I'm going with this, but I'll get back to this when I talk about Trump. So for Kevin's paper, so Bertjan makes this distinction between seeking power and wielding power, right? And Kevin makes this other distinction between populism, authoritarianism, and nationalism, right? And I think this actually intersects very nicely. Because when I think about it, populism to me is about, at heart, is something that you rely on to seek power, right? The idea that you are against the elite, it's very, as you noted, it's very hard to say that when you can't call out the man when you're the man, right, essentially. And so populism is much more about how you seek power, how you try to get to the corridors of power, right? Whereas authoritarianism is much more about how you wield power, right? Again, you can't really be an authoritarian and try to dismantle institutional checks and balances unless you're in a position where you can do that, right? You might have ideas about how you want to do that, right? But authoritarianism is mostly about how you actually wield power. And then nationalism is a political principle that I think can imbue both of these, right? You can sort of create justifications or potentially sort of appeals based on nationalism for both of these things. And you put it very nicely in your chart, right? That different leaders rely on these to different extents, right? And then you focus at the end on the bottom of the diamond, right? The organizational capacity. And yet again, I sort of, to echo the same comment that I had for Bertjan, what I wonder is, what if the problem or the difference, right, is not a variability in organizational capacity, but in organizational will? What if you might have the organizational capacity, but you just don't have any interest whatsoever in actually trying to create a party organization, right? And again, this is going to come back when we talk about Trump. So third thing that I want to talk about is one common thread that I saw, and this sort of belies my research interest in the European Union, right? I think the role of the European Union, the EU, in both of these papers is fascinating, right? Because it seems like the EU can be seen as a contributing factor to European populism because it's just such a perfect boogeyman and stand-in for everything that populists rail against, right? So it can be the out-of-touch, condescending elite, right, that is trampling on the will of the people, right? So the sort of unelected Brussels bureaucrats trope who are really making all the decisions instead of national governments, right? It can be the instrument by which globalization and neoliberalism is being shoved down the throats of these hardworking people, right? So the fact that the EU is regulating certain industries and therefore people are getting fired, like you can blame that on the EU, right? It's also a foreign external influence that meddles in national sovereignty, right? So if you're looking at the Front National, right, like their slogan was "Non à Bruxelles, oui à la France." No to Brussels, yes to France, right? The EU is this outsider, right? Viktor Orban saying that, Brussels is the new Moscow, right? That there's this external kind of pressure, right? So the EU is a stand-in for that as well. And finally, in the past couple of years, the EU has also become this sort of metaphor for immigration, right? So if you think about the Brexit campaign, for instance, right? The EU was the reason that all these Poles were taking British people's jobs, right? That's how it was portrayed, right? So in the West, it's about Eastern European immigration into Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, now with the migration crisis, right? It's the EU that's to be blamed for Syrian migrants, right? It's never Assad. If you listen to Viktor Orban, right? The root of the refugee crisis is Angela Merkel. It's not Assad bombing his own people. That's irrelevant, right? It's Merkel saying, oh, we'll get this done, and we'll be okay even if we take in refugees, right? So in that way, I think the EU plays this really important role, and I think it's really interesting to note that all of the parties that you mentioned, and actually even those parties that you didn't mention, in terms of populist parties in Europe, whether in Eastern Europe or Central Europe or Western Europe, has some sort of anti-EU platform, right? There's not a pro-EU populist party in Europe that I know. So what does this tell us about the United States and Donald Trump? That's what I want to end with. Well, I think it's really important, and this is why I'm really glad that this conference happened, that all the ways in which Trump is not exceptional, right? He, I think, is part of a trend. And when you think about this differentiation between seeking power and wielding power, right? When you're looking at how Donald Trump sought power, how he campaigned, right? I think it's important for us to say, yes, he is the American Berlusconi. He is the American Viktor Orban. We can learn something from that, right? And I think partially for pressures that have to do with academia, right? Political scientists who study the United States have diverged from people who study comparative politics in general, right? And so it's not automatic that we'd be making these connections. I'm really glad that this conference makes those. But I think Donald Trump may be exceptional when it comes to wielding power. And the reason I say that, right, is that all of these populist leaders we've been talking about in Europe, whether Eastern Europe or Western Europe, had some sort of political agenda that they were trying to implement, right? They had policy goals. We might find some of them really abhorrent, right? But they ran on policy platforms, something that they wanted to do, kick out immigrants, do whatever. I don't think that's the case with Donald Trump. From what I've seen, the impression that I've gotten is that he has absolutely no idea what to do with power once he has it. His goal was to become president. His goal was not to become president, to do something, right? And so, as Kevin noted, right, Trump hasn't actually taken advantage of his position in the ways that others might have, right? And I think you noted that that's partially because of his lack of organizational capacity. I think it's also because of a lack of organizational will. He's not interested. I mean, if you look at how he entered the healthcare debate, he didn't bother to read it. He didn't bother to have an opinion on it, right? And so I think Trump might be very different in that sense and much more unpredictable in that sense because he doesn't have a political agenda, right? And so my question is, and I don't really have an answer to this, I don't know whether that makes Trump more dangerous or not. But I do think it makes him different from Viktor Orban, right, who has very sort of clear ideas of what he wants to do, sort of along nationalist lines, ethnic lines, etc. So that, I think, is a question that we can all sort of speak to and maybe discuss a little bit further. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you to all our panelists for their presentations. So I'm going to take questions now. We'll start with Steve.
Papers a lot and learned a ton from them. One thing that really, as a Latin Americanist, struck me was the importance of party organization and investing in party organization. That's something that, at least in recent decades, not so much in the darker past, but in recent decades, most Latin American populists have not invested heavily in party organization. But there's reason to think that those, and Ken has written about this, that those who have actually been more successful. And makes one think about the difference, for example, between Evo Morales and the MAS in Bolivia and Correa, who I think is going to pay a price for not having invested enough in an organization in Ecuador. And it makes me think a lot about Keiko Fujimori's recent investment into a pretty strong party organization in Peru, which is now night and day stronger than every other organization in the country. So one question about Trump, though. So Trump absolutely doesn't build a party organization. He's not a party builder, he doesn't have a political project, but he does inherit the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is a mess in many ways, and I argued earlier in the morning that it's hollowed out. But on issues in which these two join forces and are allies, they can actually look somewhat like Poland and Hungary. And I'm thinking specifically about voting rights. That there are issues in which the interest of Trump and the entire Republican machine may be aligned, and there we may see behavior that looks more like Hungary and Poland. Very quickly on Zeynep's excellent presentation and this debate about whether parliamentary or presidential systems are more dangerous or more vulnerable to populism. I think your point is probably right, but it's worth noting that the norms of consensus that you point to are also informal norms that can erode. And I think I'm way out of my league here, but it helps to explain a little bit some of the differences we see in Hungary, Poland on the one hand, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia on the one hand, and Belgium, Netherlands on the other hand. But we already see politicians beginning to hack away at those norms. And if that norm erosion continues, then the problems, then the checks and balances within parliamentary systems that you point to could be just as vulnerable as the checks and balances that we talked about in the morning.
Two short comments. I mean, something that I think came across the two papers, but then the presentation, it's the issue of how do we understand the success of populism. And I think this is a relevant question, something that myself, I have been working with Cas, and I think one of the mistakes in the European literature is we take for granted that the only way in which we should look at success is electoral strength. And then if you look at the European picture, with the exception of Italy, these are parties that are very unsuccessful. I always say to my European colleagues, I come from Latin America, we are talking about parties that get 50% of the vote. So in this sense, why the hell should we care about parties that get 10 or 15% of the vote? But then there are two other yardsticks that are things that are very important. One is agenda setting, and the other one is policy impact. So if you want to understand the Netherlands today, it's everything about immigration. And this is because of the agenda setting capacity of Wilders. And in fact, now probably the government is not there yet, but we'll see which kind of government will appear, but probably it will try to strengthen like immigration issues. And this is not necessarily because they believe in that, but to a certain extent because of the pressure of the Populist Party. And the other one is policy impact that is related to that. I mean, someone mentioned the issue of Brexit. I mean, why the hell the Conservative Party decided to move into that direction? It's because they felt the pressure, they played with fire, and it went wrong. So, but then you have a huge policy impact for the European Union. Having said that, comes the issue that Bertjan said, well, what about the positive impact of populism? Probably everybody in this room don't like these parties. But the party system is getting much more responsive. I mean, there are a bunch of people within Europe that don't like immigrants, and parties were not taking that issue at all. So now the system is reacting to a certain extent. Look, Denmark. Normally, if we look democratic indicators, we'll say Denmark, it's great. It won, and it has one of the toughest immigration laws within Western Europe because of a populist radical right party. Is democracy not working properly in Denmark? No, it's working quite well, but it's tough on the issue of immigration. Having said that, I'm an immigrant that I have been living in Europe for quite a few years, so I'm not supporting that agenda, but still. And a minor point, the second comment, is related to the issue of the European Union, that it's an interesting one. And I think probably we need a bit more of research into that. The first issue is, right, populist radical right parties are against the European Union today, but not before. The Front National was very pro-European in the past. So now it started to change in part because of the Great Recession and also because of the immigration crisis, but I don't know how it's going to move forward. So this is the issue with populism, and it's a fascinating part. You always create the enemy. And there are different ways in which we're going to frame who are the members of the elite. I mean, Chávez was in government for how long? 15 years? I mean, and he was able to say, I'm not part of the elite. He was controlling the country, my goodness. But if you're able to generate the rhetoric, and the European Union is ideal for doing that, but at the same time, I think the real test for the European Union is how the hell to deal with the Eastern European cases. I think the tricky part, it has been Orban. Merkel, in my opinion, has made a huge mistake. The party of Orban is still a member of the Christian Democratic Party within the European Parliament. So, and now comes the real test with the Kaczynski twin, I mean, with the one of them, because the other one doesn't exist. So, but this is the real test on to what extent the European Union will play the checks and balances that you were mentioning before.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, well, a similar vein, just two comments actually. One, Zeynep, excellent comments. You mentioned that in some ways the fact that the center left and the center right can start accommodating these niche positions is a good thing. It sort of protects the system against the incursion of the radical right. But as Cristobal was saying, this is actually the danger. And I think the question is, it's also a danger. The question is, do center right, in this case, parties in Europe, take on some of the policy issues, or do they take on the authoritarianism that then threatens the system? So far, they've mostly taken on the policy issues, although with the conservatives in Britain after Brexit, it's a little touchy, right? Because, kicking out scholars and cataloging, every foreigner in the country who's in academia, et cetera, pretty problematic. But so far, it's been mostly about policy issues. So that's sort of an open question, I think, as we go forward. To what degree does the center-right move to the right, not just on nationalism, but also on authoritarianism, something we'll come back to later. And then the second comment is something else you mentioned, Zeynep, this notion that one of the consequences is not just in terms of institutional politics, but also tensions on the street. The fact that you can all of a sudden say things, in interaction that you couldn't say prior to, say, Trump's election, which results not just in ethnic slurs being thrown on the streets of places like Austin and Cambridge, actually, interestingly in Berkeley, places you wouldn't expect it, but also violence, right? This is, for sociologists, interesting enough as an end to study, because that matters, inequality matters. But I think it also has implications actually for political science, because episodes of violence that are unleashed as a result of norm violations can then become political opportunities of the kinds of crises that Steve was talking about earlier. So it's not just terrorism, it's not just North Korea, but it's also unrest on the streets, which then gives an excuse for the government to crack down on protesters, for police to start using more brutal tactics, and you've got a pretty nice slippery slope toward authoritarianism of a certain kind. And all that because all of a sudden it's okay to go to Charlottesville, protest, and run over people, right? And so I think it's kind of interesting to think about the kind of interaction between what's happening in mainstream politics, how it affects societal interaction, and how that feeds back into politics through some pretty kind of unexpected channels.
Thanks. I was just going to make a point about thinking comparatively and looking at the European cases and what does this have to say, for the Trump experience. And I think ultimately although I'm not typically an institutionalist, but I get quite interested in thinking about the ways in which certain institutional clusters in the United States shape the possibility for a Trump-like figure to emerge. And so I think the basic difference is not just between presidentialism and parliamentarism, and that has certain implications for checks and balances, but also has implications for certain kinds of political leadership. In a parliamentary system, you can't really get the kind of outsider like Trump, who doesn't have a party of his own in the same kind of way. But not just presidential and parliamentary systems, but I think presidentialism combined with primary elections. And without the primary elections, Trump would have to run as an independent or third-party type of candidate. You couldn't take over a mainstream political party as that kind of outsider figure without the primary elections. And then also the fact that you've got single-member district plurality elections in the United States, so you don't get the, there's a reason why in Western Europe, at least, these ethno-nationalist type parties, they nowhere have they won national elections in Western Europe. They emerge not within the mainstream political parties, but they emerge as niche parties on the far right flanks of the mainstream party systems. But in a two-party system like the United States, where each party has to cover a broad range, you end up getting that kind of ethno-nationalist current that emerges within a mainstream political party. And whereas we think of plurality election systems as forcing the parties to compete for the median voter in the center, it doesn't necessarily work that way in the current climate in the United States, where the Republican Party in particular has been pulled to the right by these movement currents. So ultimately, I think you can see a cluster of institutions in the United States that shape a Trump kind of phenomenon in a way that operates quite differently in Europe, where you have a very different cluster of institutions. And I think then the intra-European comparisons between the East and the West, the post-communist in Europe and the West, look quite interesting.
Between
between populism, ethno-nationalism, and authoritarianism. You had that thing at the bottom on organizational capacity. So what's interesting to me is when you did this sort of array of possible seriousness of consequences from effective to ineffective, even though the least effective populists in your European group were the ones that really are only populist with nothing else, and then Trump actually covers your whole chart except organization at the bottom, you end up really comparing him to the least effective ones because of that organizational thing. So there's two questions. One is, why not give more weight to the ethno-national and authoritarian? I know you started to in your implications, but it seems to me that that could be expanded. And the second one is, why not broaden the notion of organizational capacity at the bottom? I mean, we tend to think of it as, people have been talking about as the ability to effectuate a program through a party apparatus. But if part of the American radical right, or even not so radical right agenda, has always been to dismantle the New Deal and post-New Deal administrative state, Trump is doing a pretty good job of that. I mean, he's been staffing the courts, but has left most of these offices unstaffed throughout this massive bureaucracy at the same time that they've installed pretty ideological people at the top of these organizations. So environmental regulation and protection is being transformed. The Justice Department is being transformed. The Commerce Department is being transformed. The Energy Department is being transformed. Even the State Department, where everybody says Tillerson seems like, compared to others, a reasonable person, they're staffing it with nobody, and he does take it as his mission to represent Trump's foreign policy. So I think even on the dimension of organizational capacity, if we think about that as not being just party building, but dismantling the state, there may be more there than you credited.
So I have not read either of the two papers. I'm basing my comments only off of the presentations. But I think for Mr. Deegan-Krause, it would be interesting to definitely look at the case of Macedonia in Southeast Europe. I think if you look at the diamond that you presented with us, that the former decade-long rule of the Gruevski party in Macedonia would virtually fill up the whole. Ah, okay, yes. So, yes. Yes, I would argue that it definitely does. I mean, the party used a lot of extreme nationalist rhetoric. It has large minorities in the country. Populism of they were going to build. They had this whole ideological campaign of we build, no other party builds. They aren't a fringe party. They are the center-right, although they are far-right essentially in their ideology. Authoritarian, the European Union used a term in Europe that it never used before, state capture. Essentially, the political party completely captured the state for its own purposes. And then organizational capacity, it's also the richest political party on the European continent. So it has so much land, so much funds that it receives, both legally and illegally, mostly illegally, that it really is a unique case to kind of present all of this. So I would definitely recommend that.
I'm going to work backwards. So absolutely, thank you. No, I'm not going to do that for everyone. But so I'll just in working backwards. I think you're absolutely right on the notion of dismantling the state. What I wanted to do in here, in part for time, space limitations, and in part because I wanted to be very careful, was to not go after those things where I disagreed from a programmatic standpoint with what they were doing, but from a kind of democratic institution standpoint. So I think you're absolutely right. Interestingly, the one place where they have filled all of their positions has been in the Justice Department. The judgeships and all of the U.S. attorney positions, all of those are filled. That is the. The U.S. attorneys are fired, but the new ones have. Well, they just did 42, and the rest are. They're on track. So they're actually, I mean, they've moved ahead with those much more rapidly than any others. So I think you're right on that. That is a little bit of a sign of danger. And I think there are certain of these areas of kind of opportunistic insight into where some control can be had. Overall, though, I think that question of dismantling is something. It's certainly something I have to pay attention to. I don't know that it's part of the question of sort of democratic continuance as opposed to policy, you know, what we'd like to see in terms of the EPA or in terms of the Labor Department or other things. So I think that's really important. On the question of organizational capacity, I think you're also right in that it probably needs to be divided out, disaggregated into multiple ways. There is a question of party organizational capacity. There's a question of government organizational capacity. There's a question of government organizational will, which is maybe a kind of deeper psychological question when we get to party organizational capacity. And then there's, you know, the capacity to make the appeal, but then the capacity to actually do the to do the work. And I think sort of pulling those apart would be really interesting. Interestingly, on one thing, I would argue that Trump is not as much of an exception as he might look in lacking the will to actually do anything. Because not the ones I've mentioned, but a whole variety of other leaders in Europe who have achieved, Central and Eastern Europe, who've achieved 7, 8, 15% of the vote have been people like Kukiz in Poland and other people who really clearly don't have much of a sense of what they would do, you know, if they were in power, or much of a desire really to do that. Or the Party of National Resurrection in Lithuania, where clearly the goal was to get access get access to government, or in Czech Republic, the Party Public Affairs, where the only goal, as stated by the party founder in a subsequently released memo, was to get access to government contracts for his, for his company. So how do you win an election if you want to get engaged in corruption? You found an anti-corruption party, and actually that's exactly what happened. So I think these things need to be disaggregated. Trump may not be quite as weird because we have this new group of people who see this as a project. They see this as self-glorification or self-gratification, and the institutional mechanisms are such that they can. And here's another place where I should have talked a little bit more about organizational capacity, because I think there's a difference between long-term sustainable organizational capacity and short-term electoral organizational capacity. Some of these parties have been brilliant in organizing on social media. They've been brilliant at getting people together in certain ways. I did some campaigning for one of the candidates. I won't mention which one. And I found out that the other candidate wasn't doing any campaigning at all, but was actually just giving out lawn signs near the Walmart. That worked a lot better because it reinforced people's notions of what was acceptable and what was popular than knocking on a bunch of doors of people who were already going to go and vote and do it there. So they're able to organize in ways that are maybe surprising. What we're finding, and I really want to talk about Latin America, is what we're finding is these don't work in the long run. You can win an election once this way. You can't really win you can't sustain your party for the long run for that way. So I think there are multiple ways in which we can think about organizational capacity. And I apologize to those of you whose questions I'm not getting to, but I don't want to take all the air out of the room. The last thing I want to talk about is just this question of different kinds of norms and different ways of doing it. Presidentialism versus parliamentarism is one thing. Formal versus unwritten norms are another. I think one of the big questions here, the big underlying thing, is multipartism. That when you have multiple parties, when you have a certain number, I mean, the debate used to be, between too few parties and too many parties. Well, it looks, at least from these cases, that the safer side is the side of too many parties. Maybe you won't get much done, but you won't get much bad stuff done. And what's happened in the United States is we've got these two massive parties separated by what is now a seemingly hermetic barrier, that it makes it very, very difficult to go across. The parties themselves are weak, but the divide is strong. And I think that may be the recipe for disaster, because what it means is a lot of things that happen in Europe can't happen in this country. If you get a consensus of people who want to see democratic norms respected on both sides, and I think there are lots of people on both sides that want to do that, they cannot, because of that divide, work with one another. And so I think as long as we are separated at the cleavage level, and then our parties are weak enough to allow odd people to come in, I think we get into a real problem. The day before the election, my students want to know finally what I thought about the election. So I did my whole spiel, and in the end they said, well, who's going to win? And I said, well, here's the interesting thing. Comparing US to Europe, I wanted to be as neutral as I can. The interesting thing about European systems is that you can get somebody like Trump who's going to win 17% in a proportional representation election, and he's going to get into parliament. Maybe he'll be a junior member of a government coalition, and maybe he'll be excluded. Maybe there'll be a cordon sanitaire. In the United States, that 17% can get him 40% of the delegates, which maybe can get him 100% of the nomination, but that won't get him the presidency. So the United States, it's an all or nothing, and probably nothing will be the populist result. And that's why I don't make predictions anymore.
Let me see. Thank you for all your comments. Very useful, very relevant. I would like to go in a little further on the extent to which there exist, let's say, constitutional checks and balances, even in the European, or even also in European cases. I agree that that is an important issue to take into account and to assess the extent to they do or do not exist, or if they exist to the extent it is changing. I think some of these are particularly sometimes the role of the heads of state. Italy particularly, the president has played a very important role in hindering, sometimes promoting the power of populist coalitions, I would say. Bureaucracy and the way bureaucracy is organized is very important. In some countries like the Netherlands, it's much more like, well, the technicians who will be there all the time, they're not, even there is some kind of political color usually with the heads of the departments, they tend to be very neutral still. So in that sense, they see themselves as the true guardians of continuity and so forth. And that is exactly why they are also criticized because they're part of the elite. But they are an important, I would say, stabilizing factor, so to speak. Constitutional change, possible or not, yes, but sometimes if constitutional change is difficult, it is played out through other laws, like electoral laws. And like in Italy, the game is all about the bonus. The largest party or coalition will get many more, will get an absolute majority in parliament, basically. So there are still games going on in trying to circumvent constitutional limits, so to speak. The issue of the EU as the perfect bogeyman, yes, I agree, but I think we should take into account that that implies that that will produce alliances of all kinds of actors, also left-wing populists, also more traditional conservative parties that we do not identify with populism at all. And that may sometimes result, like in the Netherlands, in referenda that basically turn down the EU. So that, yes, but it widens the perspective. I would say it's about Euroscepticism is more than radical right EU and anti-EU stance. I think the most depressing and challenging question is indeed about societal polarization and the decline of, I think it's a mutual recognition, right? I don't have a very precise answer to that. I think I would take into account indeed inequality, as was mentioned here, as a major issue. I think underestimated in Western Europe at least is the center-periphery cleavage that I think persists and might even be stronger than in the past. And I think we should, in the causal mechanism of this, also take into account the role of media in polarizing news because of the logic of the media and because of a thing I cannot explain, but I simply observe that one way or another, politicians, even if elections are far away, every day seem to have to react to the polarized media rather than saying, well, let's think it over and come back next week. But that I never understood that mechanism, but that short-term perspective that they have adopted. I think that sort of covered most things. Trump as a non-policy-seeking person, and comparing him to Berlusconi, yes, I could relate to that. But if he really is the American Berlusconi, I mean, Berlusconi at least assured one thing, that nothing would happen that would get him into jail or would prevent him from continuing politics and so forth. So I guess that would at least one drive behind Trump as a president still, I guess. I think that sort of covered the main issues. Or am I insulting by not responding?
Just about how mainstream left and mainstream right parties responding to these populist movements and how that is maybe a bad thing. We can look at this in terms of two different outcomes. One is the success vote share or government participation success of populist parties. In that sense, that kind of accommodating strategy has been quite powerful to keep them out of government, to keep them out of winning majorities or even, sizable representation in the parliament. On the other hand, I can see your point that, it's even further polarizing the society by becoming more, the center, left, center, right parties becoming more extreme in their stances towards, let's say, immigration, towards the European Union, and that kind of polarizing the society. Some people would argue in the literature that that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, that overall, at the end, it's going to be the median voters' preferences will be still represented, given the governments are going to change from left to right, right to left. And this is a good thing that, the extreme voices are brought into the mainstream politics. And overall, it's good for democratic representation in the short term. In the long term, that's what I'm afraid of, creating even more divisions, even more polarization, and eventually lack of conversation, blocking, and then what we see here in the US emerging, or what we see in Turkey emerging in Western Europe as well. So, yeah.
Sure. Just three very quick things. I think you're right that not all anti-European parties are populists. I don't think that's true. I do think that almost all populist parties in Europe are anti-European, though, right? So I think, I just wanted to clarify, but I think you're right. The second thing on Trump, Berlusconi, I agree. I think there are certain personal goals that Trump has, just like Berlusconi had with, making sure that his media empire was still okay. I still think that's a little bit different from a policy goal in terms of, something that I don't think that that's about how you want to change the country in a certain direction. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, I think Steve brought this up, that one thing that is different is that Trump inherited the GOP to a certain extent, right? So he doesn't need to build up his own party and build up his organizational capacity. He kind of sat on it, right? The reason I find that interesting, right, is because up to now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that he has turned the GOP into a populist party yet. I think he might, but that I think is a different ballgame. If we have a populist party in a two-party system with a Trump on top of it, that I think is a different setup than having a populist president in a two-party system. Right now, I still think of the United States as the latter. I think there's a big danger if it becomes the former.
Yeah, and one final point that was made by Roland, which I forgot, but which is important, I think, the extent to which populist parties change discourses and so forth. I think that is an important issue too, and I think at least the very thing that they have produced is making public and political discourse more insulting, raw, and making those type of, let's say, violent discussions legitimate. I think that there's a major shift in how political culture is operating nowadays. But at the same time, I think we should also then investigate how maybe hidden intellectual discourse feeds into populist discourse, so to speak, at the mass level. Like today in Germany, so behind AfD and so forth, are also now German intellectuals who basically now come out and say, well, German culture is in danger, and we should be worried about that. And in that sense, they also delegitimize discourses of populist parties. That's an interaction between the two. Yeah, thank you for that.
We have time for a few more questions. If anybody, Caitlin?
Talking about the problem with the incivility in discourse and polarization, especially this kind of at the level of social identity. I attended a short course on polarization at EPSA, and the Americanists in the room were very careful to distinguish those things, and some argued, as was mentioned up here, that maybe the polarization is not a bad thing, but it's the incivility that is a problem. So I guess for the whole panel, my question is, to what extent is incivility driven by the polarization, and can we actually think of it as an independent concept to be addressed.
So I want to raise again the issue that Mr. Orban mentioned. I mean, which for me, in some sense, is one of the most fundamental theoretical issues that's at stake here. Which, when you think of liberal democracy, it's in some sense a compromise between liberalism and the majoritarian element of democracy, right? And I mean, in the European kind of consensus democracy, especially the sort of the majoritarian has really been so limited, which also means the consensus democracy is one of the reasons for the rise of populism, as you see in cases like Austria, right? So then what do we make of that rise of populism? I mean, in some sense, is it a re-equilibration away from that heavy emphasis on liberalism and rights that all of we here embrace because we are part of the kind of cultural, intellectual elite that is really into that, and majority isn't that important to us because we know what the right thing is, right? And in some sense, you know, addressing issues that people have who are not that liberal, but they are democratic citizens too. What do we, you know, do we just say, oh, be quiet? I mean, I think it's a really fundamental, profound issue that in some sense this ugly, nasty, weird populism raises that I think we should kind of face more directly and more openly, how we can address some of these concerns, fears, problems, whatever, in a way that doesn't destroy the civility of the discourse, but that doesn't kind of just like, okay, be quiet and go away. So I think for me, that's kind of, you know, one of the most, I mean, you know, it might be more democratic, although less liberal, and how far are we willing to go in that direction and re-equilibrate before we say, oh, that's too much. So.
This point that Trump seems distinct from almost all the other populist cases or successful populist cases in that he has seems to have almost no project at all, and that probably makes us safer. One case that I can think of that, in Latin America that is maybe a bit of a warning is Fujimori in Peru, who came to office with not much of a project. But two things changed the trajectory. One is events, and two was the kind of tit-for-tat escalating crisis triggered by his initial populism. So he comes in and he's saying nasty things about the elite, and the elite pushes back, even well before the coup, well before things slide out of control, but there's pushback from the beginning, and you get kind of a tit-for-tat escalation that ends in a context of crisis in the breakdown of the regime. So Fujimori came in without a project and without an organization, but 2 years later had both a project and an authoritarian regime.
One short comment on what Kurt was saying. I think one of the problems probably in Europe, it's my impression, and something that also with Casa we have been developing, is this idea that the whole project of the European Union, it's a pretty elitist project. I mean, Habermas is very happy with that, whatever, but he's an intellectual, come on. I mean, and many of the people that were supporting that. So to what extent the European Union should be seen as a sort of undemocratic liberalism. So you're pushing liberal ideas, but in a very undemocratic way. And now what you have is a backlash of the populists saying, like, you're not really Democrats. So we might be liberals, but we are Democrats in a majoritarian sense. If people don't want that, let's go out Brexit, that's it. So, but using democratic mechanism, and I think this is part of the stalemate that we are seeing in Europe nowadays. And I think the problem is probably people within, I was 3 weeks ago in Brussels, I said that with people in Brussels probably are not going to invite me anytime again after that. But I think they don't realize that, because it's a bit this issue of living in a bubble and saying, no, this is how we think, we are the smart guys and we conceive in that way. But like real people on the streets not necessarily believe in that. And this is probably the main failure of the European project, that many people thought that this is the thing. But if you look at the grassroots, it's not necessarily like that.
Respond to something that Caitlin said about distinguishing between, polarization and sort of antagonism or conflict. And I think it's an important distinction because, I mean, it's intrinsic to the logic of populism, as we started talking about, populism has to construct some sort of antagonism. I mean, Lacloian terms, an antagonistic frontier. That may or may not be ideologically polarizing. It may have nothing to do with ideology in terms of conventional left-right structuring. You look at the case of Peronism historically. Peronism literally spanned the entire ideological spectrum from the far left to the far right. You look at a case like the Five Star in Italy. The Five Star is impossible to locate ideologically. It draws a little from the left, a little from the right. It's not at all polarizing as a force ideologically, but it draws a frontier, an antagonistic frontier between the establishment and the people, and in sort of classic terms. And so I think there are some populisms that we can locate programmatically, that they exist in programmatic space, and other kinds that are, that really don't, they're, in a sense, their position, the competition they're offering is positional. So they're politicizing issues that are not on the agenda effectively represented by existing parties. And others, really don't occupy that kind of programmatic or positional space at all. And it's a very different kind of competition. And so the divide is simply one between the elite and the establishment. And so it can be, highly antagonistic and highly conflictual, especially when somebody like Trump is flaunting the low in those, as Ostigi talks about in sociocultural terms, and deliberately violating all the norms, because that's how you can appeal to people that are alienated from the status quo. But it doesn't necessarily have to polarize in ideological terms.
Brief responses from the panelists. Kevin, do you want to?
Sure. So I think that's a really interesting notion, and we're dealing here with multiple divides. So this is a territory that I really like sort of playing with and exploring. I mean, if we have a kind of partisan divide, a sort of hyper-partisanship, and maybe it's a negative hyper-partisanship, but we have something that looks like hyper-partisanship in the United States, is one thing. And then within, or cutting across that, or within each side, are multiple other divides. So there are sort of racial and identity divides. There's this question of the elite versus the mass. We have different candidates appealing to sort of different areas. It's interesting that some of those are kind of civil gaps, and others are not. So the elite mass one is not particularly civil. The party one can, in certain circumstances, be particularly uncivil as well. And so people can't cross back and forth between the others. And I think that's where we start to get into difficulty. I never thought that I would start going back into the old cleavage literature, but it looks a lot more like the old cleavage. It looks like the Bartolini and Mayer cleavage literature in terms of closure, in terms of people only dealing with people like themselves. We don't do it on the basis of social class anymore, or even necessary ethnicity here, but there is a kind of internal construction of culture that's made it difficult for people to get across and not even see the people on the other side. I mean, this was your challenge to us at dinner last night, is how many people from the other side do you know? And I think when you get that kind of divide and you merge it with an American system with weak parties and kind of open primaries, I think you get into real trouble. But it starts to bring us to this question that I certainly explicitly didn't even try to deal with because it's so complicated, which is what the underlying social geography really is, what people are actually thinking. And I think we get into deeper questions then about how democratic we want to be. If it's true that a big percentage of the population wants to behave in beastly manner to other people, I think that's a serious problem, and maybe then democracy isn't necessarily as long-lived or as effective as we think it's going to be. If, on the other hand, what we're seeing is politicians taking moderate discontent and turning it into something like that, so that it's not just what's stemming from the bottom, but what's stemming from the bottom in this kind of situational resonance that you're talking about in your paper, if it's that, then the problem isn't with democracy. The problem is with how our institutions are creating incentives for hardball politics, and that's, I think, maybe where the issue lies.
Yeah, I would like to build on the incivility question. I think that's a really important issue, and I think in general, let's say in the street, it is fed by, I don't know, people putting films on YouTube and Instagram or whatever in which they express derogatory language and so forth. It's becoming generally accepted in a way. I sound like a very old man now, I realize, but still. I think the challenge is to continuously make people aware, socialize them into repeating them, and that there are informal norms that we are apparently not even making that explicit yet about the rules of the game. That the American president is a president for all Americans and not just for no one or himself or whatever. And so maybe, I know, there are organizations in Europe like the Institute for Multi-Party Democracy that deliberately set out to train political parties, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, but into these type of values and to respect for minorities and so forth. And maybe that's a way to move forward, maybe in high schools and so forth, I don't know. But it comes back to the idea, the suggestion by Kurt, what kind of, and Kevin, what kind of democracy we want. I'm not sure, was it Dahl who said it's also about respect for minority, whatever democracy is? And I think that is maybe the more important lesson than simply the winner takes all. and I think in this country where I am a guest now, I think that sort of has become the rule of the game, winner takes all, and that is you can take whatever you want. And in that sense, as an outsider, I may sound silly to you, maybe, but I'm actually surprised that you're talking about conservative and progressive supreme justices. I understand it. I mean, it's all about the interpretation of your constitution, and it's a political and so forth. But that should be above the law. I guess they consider themselves to be above the neutral people, above the law, impartial and so forth. Yet they come out with all these different verdicts and minority opinions, whatever. I mean, but that's not discussed either. I find that part of the same issue, actually. Just like in other countries, like Italy, the judiciary have been politicized for decades, and it's an issue that is not discussed. I think, okay. Yes, I think the starting point should be respect for minorities, and the starting should be that through political socialization from childhood on and continuously, we have to hammer on civility. Yeah.